Okay, I'm still in Corpus Christi, Oxford, with Dr Luke Brunning, who is working in postdoctoral terms here at the college. You're interested in lots of different things. One of the things I know you're working on is non-monogamy, non-monogamous relationships. That sounds to me, as somebody who doesn't know that much about it, almost like the work for a sociologist. So what interests a philosopher in ideas of non-monogamy?
I mean, I think that's a good question, partly because it is of interest to sociologists, and partly also because not much has been written about it philosophically, but I think that's a mistake. So if you take a look at some of the things that philosophers are interested in and have been interested in historically, you'll see that things like love, affection, friendship, and so on are kind of core themes right from the pre-Socratics onwards. Similarly, philosophers are increasingly interested in sketching out and providing a detailed map of the various normative features of all kinds of interpersonal relationships. So what kind of behaviour is appropriate, what's permissive, what's actively good and conducive to flourishing, and so on. And so, although it may seem a kind of irrelevant or kind of slightly outre topic, a lot of these really interesting themes coalesce into the idea of living non-monogamously, particularly now when, sort of politically and socially speaking, it's relatively marginal. We have, as you sort of mentioned before we started filming, a kind of patriarchal tradition in which sort of heteronormative monogamous relationships are very much socially prevalent. Other relationships are kind of pushed into the shadows or discredited or regarded as dubious. And so given that kind of political, sort of contingent political environment, there's lots to be said about the kind of future structure of relationships, what kinds of structures should be protected and rewarded by sort of, let's say, legal sanctions or social benefits, sort of tax benefits and so on. And so, you know, if you're interested in political philosophy, you should be interested in non-monogamy. If you're interested in debates about the nature of love, whether love is exclusive or not, you should be interested in non-monogamy. And if you're interested in ethics in general, I think you can't help but be interested in non-monogamous practice, because it's either going to seem intuitively and obviously problematic, in complete tension with the kinds of love and affection that a good relationship requires, or alternatively it may seem to be an incredibly ethical practice, one that's sort of based on certain norms that everyone subscribes to, so honesty, clear communication, a sense of entering into relationships intentionally, consensually, and so on. So I think there's so many issues kind of coalesce on this one theme.
And I want to come back to some of the things you just said there, but one thing that struck me while you were initially speaking is that, of course, we've seen a certain amount of campaigning and movement and popular opinion shift towards different kinds of relationships in terms of campaigns for kind of equal marriage, gay marriage, but that seems to be something that many young people are certainly in favour of, and it seems to be kind of almost without question amongst many kind of more liberal communities, but that's still within this monogamous frame.
Yeah.
And thing that many people, when you first encounter ideas of non-monogamy, find it quite challenging, and where you put it, almost instinctively. They feel it makes them feel uncomfortable.
I mean, I think this is completely correct. So most people's initial reaction is, I would say, a very defensive one. It's sort of like, well, this is not acceptable, or even if they're slightly more open-minded, it's certainly something that's not acceptable for them, usually. And I think that you're right, that there's a kind of definite social shift with respect of sort of sexual orientation and the way that that's represented socially. But it is still seen as a problem, and you see in the rhetoric actually surrounding a lot of the debates around same-sex marriages in the UK, and particularly in America, North America. There was a kind of rhetorical move which is to say, well, what's next if we allow sort of same-sex couples to marry? Are we going to have kind of polygamous marriage? And that's used as a kind of stick.
So that must be bad.
Yeah, it must be bad, right? And in fact, there are court cases, recent cases in places like Canada, that are kind of starting to explore the political and legal ramifications of openly non-monogamous relationships between multiple people. But yeah, it has a bad reputation, in particular because a lot of people associate non-monogamy with polygamy, i.e. plural marriage. And when they think of plural marriage, they think of the marriage of multiple women to one man. Now, that has a particularly bad reputation in the minds of some people, because they think, well, it's inherently patriarchal, but not only that, it's sort of patriarchal on steroids, quite literally, and so it's seen as a very negative thing. And this creates a kind of rhetorical problem for campaigners, because some people want to say, look, they want to approach non-monogamy and say, look, it's actually much more sort of much more ordinary, much more akin to monogamous kinds of relationships. It's not this scary thing. It's not particularly different. And that was the strategy that some campaigners adopted when talking about same-sex marriages. They say, well, look, the things that you straight couples value are things that we value. The kinds of relationships you want to foster are things that we want to foster. The kind of socially important goods that you support are goods that we support. So we should have the same legal rights. And similarly, people are doing the same with non-monogamous relationship structures, and I think there's a kind of political and sort of legal savvy in doing that. The only issue that one might have is that it can erase or mask the ways in which these relationships are generally different from each other.
That's the first thing that occurs to me when I think about it, is that if you want to have them considered okay, or kind of people's attitudes for them shift, but the only way you can do it is by saying it's just as boring as other relationships, it's just as normal, you start to say, well, actually, why is a relationship that's stable and long term intrinsically better than the one that may be, more fluid or changing or short, more complicated in other ways? So that was a big strategy in the kind of equal and gay marriage campaigns, to say lots of people have been together for ages. This is long term, so it must be kind of okay, as if that was a kind of ethically validating factor. So I guess that gets talking about rhetoric. If you adopt that rhetoric and you go with it, you can almost talk yourself out of the potential ways in which these kind of relationships can be distinctive, and what's distinctive probably attracts people to them in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's correct, and I think that's a mistake, because essentially what you end up doing is implicitly sort of lauding and promoting a kind of relationship that is, in virtue of this rhetorical move, already well established, right? It doesn't need much to be said for it. Very few people will disagree that, stable relationships that exist over time are, by and large, things that are good, right? The more interesting work is definitely when people come along and say, look, other kinds of relationships are at least equally interesting, perhaps even inherently more interesting or more valuable or more important. And I think that that's where a lot of kind of emerging research will start to have teeth in the future, is to kind of explore other kinds of relationship forms, and really start to chart these distinctions that people draw in everyday life between sort of romance and friendship and sexual intimacy and non-sexual intimacy and so on. Distinctions which are incredibly difficult to maintain and very difficult to really kind of work out what they mean when you examine them in detail. And so I think that, definitely this rhetorical move is stifling, but it just implicitly erases the experience of many people for whom stable, long-lasting relationship with one person doesn't accord with their life experience. It's not something that they've either had much success in doing, or something they don't particularly value, something they don't necessarily see as particularly interesting, and those people will feel marginalised by that approach. And I think there's a huge wiggle room for people that want to come along and say, no, I think a life of variety is important, that relationships with more people actually collectively enhance each constituent relationship and so on. And again, all of these kinds of patterns of thinking are things that we think quite intuitively on a everyday basis with respect to friendship or with respect to collegiality or familial relationships. And so I think a lot of work will be done by examining those kinds of almost sort of conceptual everyday moves and applying it to the sacred area of love and romance.
And that, always returns us to where we started, really. We were saying, philosophy has done huge amounts of work on friendship. You can't really start at the kind of roots of Western philosophy without really thinking about what it means for people to kind of have these productive, intellectual, stimulating relationships. But then there's been this kind of curtain drawn around a kind of monogamous thing. I'm not sure quite what the metaphor is going, but kind of a move to keep that separate. So it looks like actually you may have convinced me there's probably huge amounts of work for philosophers to do there. Thank you.
Thank you.